Today we are going to be taking an updated look at FERPA, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, and how it applies to today's educational system as we move towards a more digital age. So FERPA is one of those areas where a lot of confusion remains, and there needs to be some clarification that will provide school leaders and law enforcement the tools they need to make sure we are protecting student privacy while ensuring the health and safety of our other students as well as the school community. So throughout this presentation, we're going to talk about what FERPA is, what it's not. We're going to talk about how it applies when dealing with schools and law enforcement, and then looking at how FERPA applies and is affected by this move towards the digital age as we move more towards our reliance on technology. So, what is FERPA? Well, FERPA gives parents and adult-age students, otherwise known as eligible students, some rights to the privacy of the student education record. So parents and those eligible students, those adult-age students, those who are 18 or have started post-secondary education, it gives them the right to access their own educational records. They have the right to deny access to educational records to anyone outside of the school system. And they also have the right to correct any errors that might occur in those educational records. So if they choose to access their educational records and they notice that there's an error, they have the right to make those corrections based on the policies that are in place at the school district or in the school agency. So FERPA applies to the education records, which include grades, the disciplinary record of students' attendance records, their testing results, and any of their personally identifiable information. So anything that might be directly related to the student. And in order for it to be considered an education record, it has to be maintained by the educational institution or agency, or an agency that is acting in the role of an educational setting. So they're acting on behalf of the school or school district, then it's still considered an educational record. So there are some exceptions to FERPA protections. If there is a health emergency or a safety emergency, such as an epidemic disease outbreak, which we've seen in these last this last year with the COVID-19 outbreak, or if there is a school violence incident, such as an active shooter or an active assailant, there can be some exceptions to FERPA where schools can release some of that information that is directly related to students in order to ensure the safety of other students within the building, or to share information about those involved in the incidents or the outbreak. If there are any records that are maintained by law enforcement for law enforcement reasons, such as a school's SRO or school resource officer or the school's law enforcement unit, if there are records that are maintained specifically for law enforcement reasons rather than educational reasons, those are not considered educational records because they are not educational in nature or not related to the education of the student. So, taking that, talking about FERPA and law enforcement, how does the FERPA law affect SROs and other law enforcement units within schools and school districts? So looking at the SRO, a school resource officer may be considered a school official, which means they would have access to the educational records, and they would also have, or they would be limited in who they could disclose those records to and in what circumstances. So they could not access those educational records and then share that information with someone else. So if they were part of a police department and they accessed the educational records, they could not share the information from those records with anyone else in the police department who is not also a school official, unless it met that exemption of it being a health or safety emergency. which would necessitate the sharing of that information. Another issue that kind of comes up with law enforcement, a specific branch of that law enforcement, is with immigration. Schools cannot inquire about a student's citizenship for admission. Any child who is within the boundaries of the district or the state is required to be offered the public education. They are required to have that education, and so even if that student is undocumented and living undocumented within the district boundaries, the school is still required to allow that student to attend. The only requirement would be proof of residency within the boundaries of the agency or the district. Looking at the SROs, they are not required to report undocumented students unless, again, it was considered to be a health or safety emergency, which would require the reporting of those undocumented students. When it comes to immigration, any information about those students, whether they are documented or not, they are protected under FERPA. Even if you are coming from a law enforcement agency, unless there is a legal court order or subpoena. Without that legal or justifiable court order or subpoena, law enforcement cannot just come in and look at the records of students in their educational file. When it comes to ICE agents, they are expected to refrain from any enforcement of their jurisdiction within a school, because schools are considered a sensitive location. It's deemed that it would be very disruptive to all students within the school scenario to enforce their ICE jurisdiction within a school building during a school day. So again, unless it is an emergency situation, ICE generally will refrain from their enforcement of immigration laws within a school. And again, even if they show up and ask to access student educational data, they would have to have a court order or a subpoena, which would have to be appropriately obtained. Another big issue that has come up quite recently over the last 10 or 20 years with some of the increase in school violence is the use of surveillance cameras within school hallways and classrooms. Those are absolutely constitutional, along with the Fourth Amendment, as long as schools are avoiding areas which anyone would have a reasonable expectation of privacy, so looking at those restrooms and locker rooms. But anything within the hallways or the classroom public areas, those are approved for surveillance cameras, and those surveillance recordings can be considered educational record when they are maintained by a school or district. So again, with any other type of record, it has to be maintained by the school or district in order to be considered an educational record. If that video contains personally identifiable information about students, if it is used for disciplinary action, so then it becomes a disciplinary record, which, as we stated earlier, is part of the educational record for a student. And if that video focuses on a particular student or a particular group of students in an action. So for example, if a surveillance camera captures a school fight, those students who were involved in the fight or involved in instigating the fight with the incident, the video could be considered educational record for them if the students are identifiable. But for students that might be in the background, who might be passing by, maybe, or they're in a window that they aren't involved in the situation, but you can make out who that student is, it wouldn't be considered an education record for them because they are not the focus of that video. Also with videos that show any kind of student or school activities that are open to the public, so such as assemblies, things like that. Again, not considered or not considered educational record because it's not focused on a particular student or students engaged in a specific scenario. So, looking at FERPA in the digital age, as we increase our reliance on our technology and schools move towards digital records instead of paper records, how have we had to evolve the way we look at the federal FERPA law? So looking at data, FERPA applies to physical and digital records just the same. So just as we've all heard that with the way we need to take care of our physical data, our physical files with student information, the same care needs to be taken with digital records. All records that include student educational data, they need to be protected just as much, if not more, than physical records. So they should not be left unattended. They should always be kept secure in every way possible. So when looking at digital records, schools need to make sure they are ensuring that files and their communication is encrypted, adding that layer of security so it makes it more difficult for someone to access those files, and someone who is not intended to see those files to access those files, and then implementing some other prevention tools in order to further safeguard that data. And then when it comes time to destroy data after the time that data should be kept, making sure that the data is securely destroyed. Simply deleting a file does not actually get rid of the file. It merely gets rid of the access to the file from that location, but the raw data is still there and is still accessible to the person, to anyone who has the right tool. So anyone who knew how to get it, it would be very easy. It could be very easy for them to get them. So making sure that data is securely destroyed, just like with paper. We always want to destroy those educational records once they have completed their life cycle in a secure way, such as shredding or incinerating. Same type of deal with the digital data, finding ways to destroy in a way that it would not be recoverable. A major issue with FERPA moving into the digital age is looking at third-party vendors. So a lot of schools are starting to use more and more third-party vendors that offer free services. Teachers are always looking for new resources to use in the classrooms that are free, that aren't going to cost them money, especially with budgets being so tight with the situations that are going on right now. So it's important for teachers to recognize and understand that the laws and regulations that apply to their schools, so the FERPA expectations that apply to schools and teachers, also have to apply to any providers that have access to that student data on behalf of the school. So if we're using a third-party vendor to provide an educational benefit for our students or for our school, then they are expected to follow the same guidelines that we as a school or district or educators are expected to. So with that, they are expected to use the data provided solely for the school and the students' benefit, not for those vendors. So one of the biggest things where this becomes an issue is data mining. So a lot of those companies that will offer free services for schools or free services just in general, the way they are getting paid is they allow then partners of them, so now a third party to them, to mine that data, to gather data about the users and use that to target ads or gain further information about individuals. So it's not truly a free service. There is a cost to it, but that cost is now data as opposed to a monetary cost. It should be noted that data mining of school data, of student data, is a FERPA violation because they are accessing educational records for a non-educational use, and it is an unauthorized access of that student data. It is the school's responsibility to make sure that not only the school themselves, but any third-party vendors are also in compliance with the FERPA law. So anytime that we are looking at using a new online resource in class, we need to make sure that we understand how they are using data and what data they are collecting. It's always best to try and avoid any kind of resources that might be collecting more data than what is really needed for the purpose of that resource. And then with electronic communications, so our emails and messaging through some of our other systems, a large number of complaints that the Department of Education is receiving that involve FERPA violations are typically inadvertent or accidental disclosures of student information, which generally happens through some kind of electronic communication. So some ways to try to avoid that, again, making sure that emails are encrypted and secure, adding that layer of protection so they're harder to access from an outside, harder to access or intercept from an outside source. Making sure that anytime you're communicating with parents about their students and their students' data, making sure that those email addresses are verified with the school and the school district, or just avoiding email altogether and sticking with phone calls or face-to-face discussions, in-person discussions, just to really ensure that that data or that information is only going to who that data is intended for. So that includes talking with parents or other teachers as well, other teachers or educators as well. So here are a few of the resources or the references that were used for this presentation. And here are the rest of the references. So I hope you were able to learn a little bit more about FERPA, kind of understand how it has changed and evolved over the years, especially as we move towards a digital society where more and more of our data, personal data and educational data, is hosted in digital means.